Okay, so good evening, everybody. I've been asked and I volunteered to come up and give a talk about being a solutions architect. I want to say, today is, typically when you come to these meetings, you talk all about Flutter. I've been a part of this meetup probably for about the past year, and I've really enjoyed the hospitality of Black Airplane and Emmett and Brandon and company like that. So I've learned a lot, and I've still got a lot to learn. But that's not what I'm here to help you with. In fact, in the honor of Mr. John Cleese, and now for something completely different, we're going to talk about a little bit about what it means to be a solutions architect. A solutions architect to me is a bit of a career path in a person's professional development, especially in the technical range of things. I've been lucky to kind of work for a couple technical companies in my career. I started off working at IBM back in 1980. In fact, my first job was working as a key punch mechanic, if you want to call it that. I fixed key punches, but that was my foot in the door, so I really enjoyed that. But also at the weekends, I had personal computers at my fingertips, and that's kind of how I got involved with computing, was through my Apple II at the time. At the time that I joined IBM, the world was full of mainframes. Okay, mini computers was just a twinkle in people's eyes. Smaller business computers were out there, but they were still taking up in very large professional areas. The type of talent that was there at the time to support this was typically a systems engineer, and you had basically a person who knew how to fix, and a customer engineer. The customer engineer knew how to fix the box if it broke. The systems engineer would apply the patches and software updates and stuff like this and work with the client. That role has kind of migrated over the past couple of years. In fact, as I'm kind of moving through my career, let's say back in the 1998 rate timeframe is kind of when I rejoined IBM after working for Apple and a couple of the companies at the time, that we got into this space called e-commerce. And this is kind of when the web really kind of came into play. We just came out of the phase of saying, okay, we can set up websites and kind of do some cool stuff and put content out there, but now let's start doing transactions and real work. And this is when e-commerce came into play. One of my first jobs with IBM as an architect was in the context of helping rewrite the Hertz.com website. And that whole thing was an exercise in a learning process, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit later. And as that has matured, you're starting to see the emergence of cloud computing and distributed computing and things like that, and it's kind of led us to where we are today. And what I mean by that is you've got these mobile devices that you have a chance to use and communicate with and transfer information. You can, reserve flights, book rooms, order food. These are things that we couldn't do back several years ago. And, you need people who can understand how this process works and how to drive business direction through the delivery of technical solutions, right? And so if you think about what type of projects I get involved with, they're complex, they're large. When I say large, it can be anywhere between 20 people and 2,000 people working on a project. And for example, one of our largest customers that I work for in my current company, we help move a monolithic e-commerce application. Basically, one application was all one big hairball that worked on a very large system. And whenever they wanted to do a system update, they had to schedule it probably once every 6 months before they could do things. And it was just a mess to be able to put in changes and turn things on, whatever. And we said, okay, look, the smart thing to do now, because of architectural patterns in play, we're to break this up into more distributed process and use microservices. So you can say, business functionally, you can say, here's an order component, here's a payment component, here's a profile component, and you can fix those independently out of sync with each other. And so we had to lead them through that process of how to make things happen. So again, a lot of what we do is take customers and go through what I call a digital transformation process. So, a lot of people who pretty much played with like Flutter to a degree have spent most of their time working on the front end of applications. And that's just a component, in my opinion, of what a solution might be. We've also changed certain methodologies of project approach. So for example, you see over here, more of an agile methodology of project engagement. A long time ago, it was waterfall. It was big design up front, design, build, deploy, operate, okay? And if everything went smoothly, which it never did, okay, you finally get something out there several months after you started the project. Now, we've come up with this way of build little bits at a time, show value, improve, get people's impact. And because business changes at the same time a project changes, and to be able to be flexible like this really helps. And the reason I bring this up is because you have to change your mentality of how you look at a system and how you interact with people, processes, and technology to drive things through. So, as I was saying, most projects I work on is fairly large. And what I mean by large is 18 months or more, $2 million more in project size, could be number of people, etc. And as I describe things to people, because again, they look at things like, oh, it's just an app. It's so simple. You can do that, right? Well, the problem is that that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's all you can see. That's what I call systems of engagement. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there's also a lot of things happen below the scenes. Now, that below the waterline can be process, technology, people, what have you, data, for example, to make things work. And you have to coordinate all this stuff to work correctly so that you can deliver a proper solution. Okay? Now, we've been in a very interesting area of change, technologically. A lot of people have came pre-Netflix. We used to have a thing called Blockbuster. We used to go back and rent these things called DVDs. And, you've got late charges and stuff like this. But, business changed. The ability to stream video now usurped the ability to rent video, or rent video in the physical media at least, right? So because of the pain in certain market spaces or processes already, people come up with a better way of doing things. Uber replaced taxis, or at least augmented where taxis are. Apple didn't mess up the music industry with their iPod, but they changed how you consumed media to the benefit of the music industry once they figured out what the whole thing was about, right? Because before Apple really kind of got serious about this, there was this ability to exchange music under the table, LimeWire, what have you, like this, right? So now we've got things like Spotify, Apple iTunes. People spend probably as much a month as they did on one CD a long time ago, and they get access to a complete music library of things. Now, Amazon's changed things, and the whole point of I'm bringing these things up is technology isn't the changer. The business process is the changer. Technology is the enabler in this process. So thinking how a customer thinks or understanding their business processes and pain really is where the value is in here in this relationship as being a solutions architect. Now, if you get into a project, there are several roles that are pretty key, right? There is the project owner, the person who owns the problem that you're trying to solve. There is a project manager, the person who's trying to coordinate things from your side of the business to make sure things work correctly. There might be a graphical designer or a UX type of person who can articulate what the person's idea is and put it in a storyboard fashion so that you can go ahead and move this thing forward and kind of figure out how to solve problems as they come up. And then obviously you've got the technical staff, and that technical staff could be a developer, a tester, DevOps people, database people, what have you. But there's also kind of a key leadership role here, and this is what I call the solutions architect, okay? So a solutions architect to me is really kind of the person who owns the technical solution, technical solving of a problem, okay? Now, this person has really good skills in the way of interpersonal communications, they understand technology, and they're able to articulate and solve problems with both the technical staff as well as with the client staff is in place. In fact, if you think about what an official definition was, and I've just kind of found this in the network, and I thought this was pretty appropriate. This person, this role, has to have a combination of technical design skills or technical skills and business acumen. You have to have this balance. You have to understand why you're doing something and how you can do something. This means we'll be working with clients to make sure they understand what their problems are. One of the things about being an architect is the word architect is basically one who builds, okay? The thing is that if you ask your peers what they think an architect is that the people who understands how to build a building, okay? There's no difference really between that skill in a way, and I hope I'm not insulting any architects or any technical people that you use to drive a decision or a vision or a building of what the whole process is for an architect. Hey guys. Lee, do you have something you want to say, or would you? Okay, good. All right. Okay. Anyway, so I put a reference down here to this Walland article. Anyway, again, like I said, when you think about an architect, there's different ways when people hear the word what it means. putting things together, building bigger things. And then at the end of the day, of course, we're here trying to solve problems and pulling our hair out, making things happen. Now, the architect role integrates specifically on the technical side of things with certain key resources and roles. So, for example, they have an influence on what the technical delivery is going to be, what the direction is going to be. They may interact with the people who actually do the engineering, which is different than architecture. I'll talk about that in a second. And then you may work with some specific tactical teams, like again, the UI, UX people to figure out what is it they're trying to do. And then also anything that has to do with third-party components and solutions. So for example, if you're playing with Flutter, you may have a good relationship with Google, and you have to understand how to speak Google to be able to figure out how to use those tools to deliver your solution in place. Now, what they do, we just talked about the who, but we're going to be talking about the what they do, is they have different roles, and it's a little bit of an ADHD type of role, I'll tell you honestly, right? A developer, you sit there in front of code, you get stuff done. An architect, in my way, has to do several different things at once. One is, how do you take a certain situation and modify it? Bring the strategy together. So you have where am I right now? Where do I need to be? And how do I get there? Your ability to articulate what that idea and decisions are with people is very important. Okay? How do you involve context, which is very important? Like, for example, if I was to work on a project for a travel and transportation industry, how they think, how they operate is different than a telecom industry, which is different than a consumer packaged goods industry, right? So understanding how the business works in a holistic standpoint can help influence how you decide to solve a problem, okay? Defining the vision, drawing pictures. Sometimes when people ask me what I do is I kind of flippantly say, I draw boxes and arrows. And I'll show you some diagrams of those a bit later. But the reason I say that is because I try to take ideas that are people's heads and put them in a format that people can see and agree to. Okay, you'll see that kind of in a second or two. Now I'm stealing this slide a little bit from my material that I use to teach classes inside of Capgemini. A solutions architect is not just one role. There's about a Heinz 57 or a Baskin Robbins 31 different flavors of what an architect is. A person can be very deep in a particular technology. They can be a database person. They can be a front-end person. They can be a data analysis person. Yet they can still have all these skills that kind of go across the top that unify their ability to see how it applies to business. So, for example, you may start with an engagement with a client and say, okay, what is your strategy? How are you supposed to get there? What are you trying to solve? To me, that's more the enterprise architect view of things. How does the whole system work? So, for example, if I was to go talk to Coca-Cola, as an example, Coca-Cola isn't exactly one company. There's actually 4 different companies to Coca-Cola, 4 different entities, you can call it this. There's Coca-Cola corporate, and what they do is they handle marketing and making the syrup. There's Coca-Cola bottlers, which is an independent entity, and they basically take the syrup from the company, bottle the product, and then they take it to their customers. Their customers are not us. We're the consumers. Okay, the customers are the Walmarts, the Krogers, the baseball parks, the people who actually sell the product. And to understand that context of how business relationships work when they're trying to solve a particular problem gives you the point of view that says, how can I solve your problem using the technology at hand to make sure that what you're trying to make happen. So that's kind of the strategy, enterprise architecture, business architecture kind of point of view on that. And obviously, whenever you get to the point to where you can start a business or start the process, there's the art of, the whole flow of define, design, develop, deploy, operate, those type of things that you have to do to make sure the solution happens. And that's kind of what happens over here on this end, to where you as an architect are the technical design authority. You're the person they go to and they say, hey, I got a problem. Can you help me work this out? And then that's the person who kind of sits back and makes things work. You also have a bit of what I call project architecture. This has to do with, you're not a project manager, but you have to have enough skill and acumen to understand what do you do as an architect that affects the success of the delivery of the project. It could be, hourly cost of an employee, or how long do we work on a particular section and how much are we going to charge back to the client. You have to have an understanding of how this business of process delivery comes to play from even a financial impact standpoint. Application engineering, how do you actually take a particular stack, like for example, if you go to Salesforce or you go to SAP, or pick your typical set of either cloud platform tools that you would assemble to make your parts and pieces work. Do you understand how these things work correctly? And then let's kind of put a more of a Flutter twist on this. Do you understand how Flutter works? Do you understand how the modules and the frameworks work so that you can deliver the solution you're looking for? And then how do you produce what you're trying to do? This is industrialization and DevOps. And then there might be platform engineering. Again, this gets more back to an operational perspective as a technical or architecture perspective. And then all the way through here, you got to make the thing run. After you deliver the product, it's not like, congratulations, you got a baby boy, and you go, right? You have to say, here's a solution now, how can I help you operate it and monitor it and approve it and go forward from there. So if you think about it, we as architects, we kind of deal with the invisible. We deal with software. We deal with solutions. Nothing we can produce is really tangible other than the fact that what we do produces results for companies, okay? The other thing we do is, as you can tell how I'm talking, is we deal a lot with people, right? We have to get their points of view across. We have to listen, articulate, reply, refactor, figure out what's going on with their directions, and make sure that they understand what our point of view is, and we understand what their point of view is to kind of bring the solutions together. And then ultimately, we're responsible for the technical delivery of the project. So, as if you think about architect and architecture, you might be thinking about this little area here. It's kind of a green bubble. And that's kind of where the initial domain of what an architect might exist in. They design the process, they define what's going on, and they kind of give hints to everybody else who's part of the project to make things happen. Engineering is more in the, how do I make this stuff work? Again, it could be a developer, it could be an infrastructure person putting things together. This person has to bring the idea over the person who's got the skills necessary to make things happen. And then again, you've got the ongoing operations of that. So in 6 months, is your KPI is hitting correctly to make sure that the success of what you were targeting for works correctly. And you have to have this context of all this stuff working together, which is kind of why we bring what we call delivery architecture in the process. And in the middle, you can see project management. So again, having a flavor or an understanding of project management is how it helps not only you control what you're trying to deliver, but you influence how the project's going to go, okay? So you as an architect have a good span of involvement on a process. So for example, my coaching for people who want to kind of get into this field is you have to have kind of a balance of a mixture of knowledge here. Not only just the technical knowledge of a certain thing, right? Whether, again, your database, your infrastructure, your front-end technology, what have you. You have to have some concept of how do you articulate a problem? How do you troubleshoot something? How do you design something? And then you have to have sector knowledge. And sector knowledge to me is like the industrial application of certain things. So, for example, again, an automotive company thinks different than a telecom company, which thinks different than a quick-serve restaurant, right? As long as you understand the context of what that business is, the solutions you derive through this process can be successful. And then you have what I call consulting knowledge. And what I mean by that is there's a good amount of soft skills that are involved in being a good solutions architect. How do you relate with people? How do you get along? How do you get through the really tough conversations with people to make certain things happen? Okay? How do you make sure that you make them feel successful as what you're delivering meets their needs or exceeds their needs? Okay? Now, some of you may have seen this kind of diagram before. And this gives you kind of the perspective of how complex a project can be or how miscommunicative a project can be, okay? So for example, what a customer wanted was basically a tree swing. That's how they explained it. The project leader understood, well, okay, tree swing, I got it. We left out a couple of requirements, obviously, right? How the analysts decided it, okay, we'll take our opportunity to innovate and come up with some great ideas. How the programmer wrote it, it passed tests, didn't it? Okay. How the business consultant described it, and then the whole process. This is really what they wanted. This is a bit of a fun diagram, but this is typical for almost every project I've ever worked on. And to be able to control how they described it through all the other people to come up with a consistent vision is the challenge of what a solutions architect is in my book. So remember I talked about boxes and arrows. So this is a kind of a redacted version of a diagram that I wrote for a client, okay? Don't worry about picking things apart too hard, but just kind of think about certain things. I try to break things down to digestible components so people understand what's going on. We have systems of engagement, systems of integration, systems of record. Systems of engagement to me are what part of the system touches the user, whether it's a mobile device, a kiosk, a web app, what have you. Systems of systems of record down here is where is the data stored? What type of content is stored? And as the systems get larger, the more distributed those systems get. So very rarely are you going to make one API call and get everything you wanted, okay? And that's kind of where the systems of integration come into play. Like, how do you make the systems of so that the transactions that you design from a UX standpoint flow from the systems of engagement to the systems of record through the systems of integration. Now, that might be the core of your system, but you can't get away from another viewpoint to say that there's other things outside of the system that influences or impacts the system, or the system impacts. So you have what I call external integration and supporting systems. So for example, there might be a configuration process or a point of sale system or a payment provider that comes into play that you have to figure out, okay, if I need to have a customer coming through this environment to be able to make a payment, how do I do that, right? And these are basically still, I would call it 25,000 foot views of things, because this could be, a 100-page document behind certain things, right? So that's one. And then also there might be other things that are outside of the limelight that you have to come into play. So for example, security issues, fraud issues, culture and language, support operations. How do you take these in place? This is what I call non-functional requirements, to where things that affect these type of systems over here would be functional requirements. These are non-functional requirements. So if you come into this as a developer point of view, you may be focusing on one or two boxes over here. As an architect, you'd be focusing on as many of these boxes as possible to understand how the system works together. Okay? Here's another diagram that I did. Okay? And the purpose of this diagram is to say, the way this operation was producing an Android app and an iOS app for the United States market, the Canada market, the German market, French, German, Australia, and I forget, there's 5 of them. So I have to figure out what the other was. The UK, that's what it was. And it was pretty complex. In other words, you write your code, you put it in your repo, stash the Bitbucket, we'll do a migration, by the way, of here to this from source code management problem. Jenkins was our orchestrator. We had build environments to make things happen, and also, quality check type systems in place. We had configuration management processes here. And then once we produced the binary, obviously we had to kind of go through the app stores to get stuff done, right? But what we didn't do well was testing. So how do you bring in the context of testing, automated testing, into this type of a complex environment? Well, guess what? Here's my yellow boxes over here that says, it's one of those kind of funny things. You take one of these cloud diagrams and you put MOH, miracle occurs here. And you kind of put that over here and you help to describe where that's going to go. Because that's kind of where we're going to go, is to say, I need to come up with a system that enables automated tests. How do I do that? Well, at that time, we were looking at a product called Appium, necessary to orchestrate mobile application tests. And so we have to tell the developers, not only do you write code, but you have to write the Appium test suite necessary to align to what the functionality you put in play, so that we can do regression tests from an automated standpoint, and therefore drive up quality. That last statement is why we're doing this. As an architect, you have to think about the business problems. As we were putting out applications that had bugs in them, well, why were the bugs? Some of it might have been injected because of new functionality. Some of it was injected because you stepped on top of something that was there from 6 months ago. That should make pop out a regression test. Okay? So to be able to improve the process is the value that we bring as architects. Okay? Here's another diagram from one of the companies that we work with here in town, Cox Communications. We helped them do a product at the time called Mobility Anywhere. It was basically a voice over IP application that they created for Android and iOS, such that if you were a Cox customer, and think of Cox like Comcast, they both do the same thing. So what does Comcast and Cox sell you? They sell you internet connectivity, they sell you TV, they sell you, home security, and they also sell you telephony. Well, the telephony they sell you is basically 1980s technology, that's what I call it. It's a telephone you sit in your desk. And most people go, what's that? Yeah, how do I work this? It's not one of these things, And so the value of that line, having that dedicated line, works well if you're in a static location, like in an office or a house. But if you're out gallivanting around, people typically have their mobile phones with them, and this is how you get phone calls. But what we did is we came up with a voice over IP application that would switch that landline to an alternative phone line on your phone, so that when somebody calls your Cox line, it would show up on your phone. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Cox is the one who owns the customer relationship. They understand the contract, they understand what's being provisioned, etc. Comcast was the back-end supplier for the functionality of this. Comcast has their authentication and identification processes in there. So, for example, if I log in with a Cox ID, how do I know that Comcast allows me to have connectivity to that voice over IP application? Drawing this diagram allowed me to talk to security people, infrastructure people, front-end people, product owners to say, this is the problem, how do we solve it? Okay? And just as another technique that I've learned along the way, right? If you label your components with letters and your paths with numbers, you can start to describe certain things in relationships. You can say, if I go to A1, 1, B1, I know exactly the conversation I'm having, and this is the problem I'm having with that. I will document exactly what that was. So again, using a diagram to drive out the complexity and understanding of what a problem is very important. Okay, so we talked about some things about what do I do as an architect, okay? Now, how do you become an architect? Let's talk about that for a second. A lot of this, as you can tell, one, I've got a little bit more wisdom than most of you, right? Is experience and time. So as you come out working on projects, you learn about the technology that goes behind it. So again, let's bring this back to Flutter for a second. So if you understand Flutter, how to compile an application, how to build an application, how to troubleshoot an application, how to test an application, how to use the frameworks in an application, how to, use components you can, download from the internet to make your application better, you become a very strong technologist. As you develop more applications, you may become a domain specialist in Flutter, because everything that you're using Flutter as a tool necessary to deliver your solution through, okay? And as you start working on projects, you start to get this perspective of probably domain knowledge. So maybe you guys go after all of these small, automotive street corner type salespeople because they need, a customer management system, they need a sales system, and you understand their business. So you can you can speak their language as you're solving the problem. Okay, so this becomes the senior. Now, as you start getting really experienced in multiple projects and multiple engagements, you build up some battle scars along the way, okay? You become what I call the go-to authority on certain things. And then at the top of this, you kind of come to that senior director, CTO level, somebody of that nature who really owns the project itself. Now, as a side note, in Capgemini, we have multiple career paths. One's a project manager, one's an account manager, and one is an architect. And we actually have different levels of architecture that we certify people's level of experience on here, right? The technicality of that person doesn't change. How they experience or how they build their ability to engage on a small project, on a large project, on a complex project, kind of gives them different grades of how we look at people as their technical competency and deliver things as an architect. Now down here, I want to kind of build up a kind of an oddball, maybe it's a Rubik's Cube type of thing. The characteristics of a person that I would attribute to be, if I looked at someone and said they're an architect, they're technically relevant. They understand the domain for their work. That's going to be it. They're very curious. How do I solve a problem? How do I take tools to make things happen better? Their attitude, their aptitude. Give me somebody who wants to learn something, and I'll teach them as much as I possibly can, right? Let them, wrestle a problem, own it, build it, make themselves proud about the fact that they solved a problem, okay? Communication. How good of a communicator is this person? How much can they exist under pressure when hard times come along? And again, an emotional quotient type of context to this, because if you can't communicate with somebody, and believe me, I've known a lot of very brilliant people in my career. I would never put some of these people in front of a client, okay? They're great engineers. They're great technologists. We put them in an architect role, okay? Because of their communication skill. So this could go over, a period of years. Let's be honest with you, right? This is not something you're going to, master in 2 or 3. This is something you kind of collect as you go, 5, 10, 15, 20 years in your career, and you can kind of be up in this range of things. Okay? So, say, Mike, I want to be a solutions architect. Okay, so let me give you some suggestions are. 1, terminally curious. Always be asking questions. Always try to figure out the why. See if there's a better way to do things. Be innovative. Develop your skills in actual project delivery opportunities. You have to do this in order to get the understanding of what the dynamics of a project are. Doing it yourself is one thing. Doing it with a team of people is another. Doing it with a band of people is another. Okay? Until you actually get into that situation, it's really hard to kind of build up those experience points. I'll put it that way in there. Always be relevant. And I bring it back to this personal story, right? So working for IBM, I got to the point too where, I was an architect, and the salespeople who were trying to sell engagements needed somebody who could talk to clients and understand their problems and articulate a potential solution and get them under contract so that our people could work and do some other things, which is great. But if you do that over and over and over again for probably 10 years, when the opportunity comes up and says, I'm sorry, we don't need your services anymore, you go back in the marketplace and say, my skills were relevant 10 years ago. They're not relevant now, okay? So that level 1 version of an e-commerce platform has graduated to level 4 or 5. Things have changed, the technology has changed, and now I got to go back and relearn a bunch of other things. Now, again, be flexible on this whole process. In fact, I've got a little character back here. If you've ever seen Gumby and Pokey as a cartoon character, look them up. And I have a saying here. So the Marines have a thing called Semper Fi. Always be faithful, right? And I've kind of modified this, or you can kind of find this called Semper Gumby. Always be flexible. Okay? An architect always needs to be flexible in the context of what's going on. If you come at things very dogmatic, you can really ruffle some feathers. You have to kind of go with the flow in certain things and be adaptable. Most important thing I would say here is understand the business and what their needs are. It goes back to that context awareness of what's going on. Rise to the needs of the moment. I think that it goes back to my experience with the Hertz rewrite project. At the time, we were going through a little bit of an internet bubble, and it was the e-commerce rush, and everybody was hiring like crazy and poaching everybody else from every place else. And several of our key people got poached away from IBM to go start a startup. It was very lucrative and very attractive. I chose to stay behind with IBM, and because of the lack of people around me, they go, hey, Mike, can you take this? I go, yeah, let's do this. Now, I burned my fingers in the project. I learned a lot because of it. But because I was allowed to be in that position, people wanted me to bring my leadership forward and help drive the program forward. It had some rough spots, but we made it work. The best thing I can say is work through people, solve the issue at hand, and try not to point your fingers and do things strong. Just own the problem, fix it, move things forward. Okay? Now, one of the things about architects, or anybody who's been kind of doing some serious development, understands the value of what we call patterns, right? So there may be some anti-patterns, things you really don't want to do, that you may see in the characteristics of people. And I call them the hero as one. And what I mean by this is the person on a project that carries everything and doesn't want anybody else to touch the project, right? The spotlight stealer, somebody who really wants the credit for everything that's going on, but doesn't really play nice in the team. The Houdini, somebody who comes on a project, describes something, and then disappears. Okay? Mr. Know-it-all, the one who basically, again, this is kind of a derivative of the hero, but they want to make sure that they know how much that they know that you know that they know, right? And sometimes that can burn a lot of cycles. The deflector, it's not my problem, go talk to that person, right? All promise, no deliver. So these are things, the characteristics of things that you kind of hopefully don't want to do, but here's some things you do want to do. A good architect to me thinks multidimensionally. Again, you have non-functional requirements, you got functional requirements, you got personalities, you got the attributes of the business you're trying to work with. He's open-minded. You know, I have a point of view. It's very arguable. I don't own that point of view, but that is my point of view. And if you want to persuade me to go something differently, present something logically and clearly, and I'll agree with you. Or we'll work it out together. Teaches others. Somebody who kind of is in what we call servant leadership role. Somebody who kind of grows the organization. So take your knowledge, make sure that other people can take over where you're at, because if you are stuck in your area because you don't have anybody around you to pick up where you left off, you're never going to go anywhere unless it's under duress, right? So you building your bench to allow you to go do something else, bigger projects, what have you, is always something's good. Communicates well. Not only are you articulate, but you have the ability to interact with people and allow them to feel part of the conversation and participate with what's going on. Takes responsibility, a team player, understands and put to use frameworks and patterns. So even though I'm not the person who writes the code, for me to understand how things work and why things go together is important to me, because I want to be able to turn over to the technical people and have a good conversation with them and have them faith in me that I know what I'm talking about. Because I'm sure that if you've ever done a technical project and you talk to somebody who's a bozo, okay, your ability to have faith in that person is for your love. But if you see somebody who understands the project, understands what's going on, and understands your problem, now you've got a team member that can help move the project forward. Okay? Low BS tolerance. You know, come on, let's cut the crap. Let's kind of get down to it and make things happen. And again, this goes back to the client. Understands the client and the task. Leads them to the path of effectiveness and maturity. Okay, so that's kind of how I would think that, you know, how do you get from here to there? Now, there's a couple of things that I've learned along the way that I would love to share with you guys. Okay? One, documentation is evidence of thought. If it hasn't been written, it hasn't been said. This will get you out of a hole, whether you're talking about project management, talking about memos with clients, things that happen in agreements, because again, it goes back to that essence that you need to understand project management dimensions and interactions to control a project than just being able to say, yeah, no problem, we'll take care of it. Because those conversations, as friendly as they're meant to be, as goodwill as they're meant to be, are the ones that bite you in the butt. Okay? The power of why. If you don't understand something, ask why. Ask why 5 times, okay, until you get to the root of exactly what the situation is going on. Reflect what you hear. Tell people what's going on to make sure they understand what your perspective is. Always be relevant. I think I talked about this area, and same with being terminally curious. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them at proportion. Listen more than you talk. Okay? Never release on a Friday. Okay? Amen. Okay? Innovate within reason. Right? Take risks, but take educated risks. Okay? Don't go, well, there's a brand new framework coming out tomorrow. You know, AWS is going to tackle Flutter. Let's go after that. Well, let them cook for a while. Okay? Trust, but verify. You know, you as an architect have got the responsibility for the delivery of a project. Put it in your hands, run it through, ask questions, figure out what's going on. Go back and sit with the developer of a piece of code and do a code review with them. All right? Sit with them and write a test case with them. Understand what's going on with the whole process. And the same thing with any other role on the project. Talk to your UX people, talk to your testers, talk to your clients. Make sure that you understand what's going on and have that point of view of ownership of the project. How you interact with people is more important than what you produce. Okay? How you deal with people can make or break how you being as a solution architect. Because you can come across as being a real rough person, and people don't want to work with you. Okay? Now, another thing I want to say here is a senior developer does not equal an software engineer and does not equal an architect. Now, there is a path to get from point A to point B, but just because you're a senior developer doesn't necessarily mean you're a senior architect or solutions architect type of role. Again, I want to go back to that whole time and experience matrix of things. It's experience. You got to cook, you got to stew a while in a particular role before you can really be successful. Now, architecture itself, especially when it comes to software architecture or business architecture, there are some key places that you can go get more information from. One's called the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF. Okay, it's the open group on the internet, and you can go get there. It's like if you've ever read what's called the PMBOK, the Project Management Book of Knowledge. This is what the architect's view of life is, as far as how do you deliver a project, what phases are there, that type of thing. Okay. There's a book by Stephen Covey called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you haven't read it, please go grab a copy and read it. You can actually get a copy of this. Go to Goodwill, buy it for $1. Okay, it's that good, and it really changed my perspective of how you deal with yourself, how you deal with other people, how you get stuff done. Okay, how do you organize things, right? There's a thing called the International Association of Solutions Architects, or IASA, which is the guy by the name of Paul Priest, I think, on the internet. You can find him in LinkedIn. There used to be a chapter here in Atlanta. I'm not quite sure if they're still very active, but again, if you want to network with some people outside of a large company that does architect type things, IASA is a thing to go to. Capgemini has a tool called the Integrated Architecture Framework, or IAF. In fact, TOGAF is a sum of all the content that companies like Hewlett-Packard, Capgemini, Deloitte, IBM have contributed as solutions, as architects to the body of knowledge, what we call TOGAF. So there's a different way that the Capgemini looks at things from a pattern standpoint that might be interesting for you guys to look at. There's a book out there you can buy to make this. And now they kind of bring this back to Flutter for a minute, okay? As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about front-end technologies, and that's kind of why I've been hanging out with you guys in the Flutter community. I'm not an expert at it. I've done a couple of demo apps, but that's about it, and that's all I want to do. But I really want to understand things. But if you want to really become a good solutions architect in the field of Flutter, study, dig, read the blogs, participate in what's going on, learn the Google platform of tooling. Make sure that you understand how does that system of engagement work with the other systems systems of record and integration to make things work correctly. And the last one is let me Google that for you. Okay, that's what that stands for. Google it. Go back and look. There's plenty of places right now, which is great for this moment in time, for people to learn things. There are actually classes on Udemy, Coursera, and Pluralsight about being an architect. So you can go back and look at somebody else's perspective on what's going on. Okay? So there is a video here. Hopefully, maybe, I don't know if we can get the audio. Does this go through audio too?
It should. Yep.
All right. We're going to try something here.
Our company has a new strategic initiative to increase market penetration, maximize brand loyalty, and enhance
I don't think it's coming through, but we got it.
Okay.
People online, just imagine.
Just follow the link.
Yeah, here's the link.
Yeah, or follow the link.
Yeah. All right, so do you want to play this for the rest of you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Come on. Here we go. The audio dropped. Hold on. Yeah. Do it. I'll go jump to that link. All right, now it's not playing audio for some reason. Okay, there's a saying in my business that says demo is a 4-letter word. Okay, and this is exactly what we're at right now. Let me see if I can jiggle the handle for a second. Sound. So I go that way.
If you do that, that probably will send it to just the online stream,
But not us.
but not you. Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, I'll leave this as an exercise, homework for you guys to go hit the link,
Stevenson.
right?
Oh. It didn't look like it was going through. Don't worry about it. We'll watch this on our own.
Yeah, definitely, okay. So I'll pass the link out, or we'll put it back in the chat or something like this, but definitely, that's one of the things I would strongly suggest you guys watch. It's it really puts a perspective on how people interact or expectations around a table whenever you have a meeting with people. And it's one of those videos that we tend to share whenever we do the architect class too, so I think you'll get a giggle out of it. Okay, having said that, any questions from you guys?
We got some from online first, so let me ask those. From Stephen Johnston, he also actually said he wrote the first e-commerce app for Cox Voice over IP,
Okay.
so small world.
Yep.
His question was, do you agree that solution architects are a part of the sales process for orgs? If so, do you find that solution architects are limited by offerings of the org they work for?
Interesting question. And I think I'll put my consultant hat on and say it depends. Okay? And the reason I say that is this. When I worked for IBM, the solutions we sold were what we call blue. DB2, WebSphere, there was a bunch of other products we sold, right? And when we came to a solution, it was like, guess what? We've got all these great products that you can use that solves your problem. And it was very true. There were some rough edges to certain products we had, but all in all, at the time, they worked fairly well. When I'm with Capgemini now, we're not beholden to a particular partner. We have a multiplicity of partner relationships. We have relationships with IBM, AWS, Google, Microsoft. Apple's not one of them. So it is as far as SAP is another big one. Salesforce is another big one that we do. So when we come to a solution with a client, I'll go back to that point where we draw boxes and arrows. I want to focus on the function of what I'm trying to solve, and then look for the right tool to put in it. Now, the right tool can go through a decision sieve that has to do with technical fit. It could be, we already have an existing license with Oracle. Why not use one of their products? Because we have an enterprise license with them, and we get, software for a nickel a pound, right? Or, this is too risky because we don't want to go with that product, or, we've never done that before. So there's a lot of things that you have to kind of solve through whenever you deliver a solution with a client. And that's one of the things I say I kind of like where I'm existing right now in my professional career, is I'm not beholden to a particular technology.
He did ask as well, how do you work through the friction if there are selected software solutions already presented?
Very good, very good. So there is a product, or remember I said documentation is evidence of thought. Okay. As you work through a project, you're going to create things, documents. There may be a document called a work product and a document called a deliverable. Okay, a work product might be the things that you kind of work a problem out and agree amongst your internal team how you do certain things. So that's just kind of maybe a guide or a how-to or an FAQ that you kind of create through. A deliverable is something you might have contractually obligated yourself for delivery, right? One of the things that we look at when we start doing certain things like assessments, a technical assessment, for example, is it's not up to us from an architect standpoint, especially from a consultancy standpoint, okay? It's not up to us to tell people, use this product. But we will come back and say, well, there's a thing called an architectural decisions document. You can look this up. There's a template. There's several templates out there for this to use. An architectural decisions document. And what you do is you describe what the business problem is. That's kind of like an abstract. And you kind of describe, here's option 1. Here's option 2. Here's option 3. We suggest option 2 because blah, blah, blah. And then you present this back to the client. And they may have a thing, either they have an architectural board or an ARB, an architectural review board, that they go through and look at the documents and make a decision or suggestion or, whatever, right? And then they also go back and say, we as the client decide to do this. And then you put this down in a document, sign it, 6 copies, and you send it out. And that way, and a couple months later, whenever the regime changes at the client, they go, well, why did you make this decision? Well, this is what we did, right? Again, documentation is evidence of thought is kind of a proper way of saying CYA in a way, okay? So there's that. There was a second part of that friction problem that if you are inside of an organization, your architect, let's say again for Cox Communications, obviously there should be a collection of things called architectural principles, okay? A principle is a guideline. Like, and I'll give you an example of a principle that we used when I was a recoder. If you had a project you need to have solved or delivered, see if you already have the asset in place to make it work. Do you already have something you build upon? Reuse what you have. That's kind of what we said. And if we didn't have one in-house, can you buy an off-the-shelf package that would solve the problem? No. Go ahead and build the application, which you need, but build it for reuse so that you can kind of continue the cycle, okay? So architecturally, you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing, not just pulling from the hip every time you get a problem. Let's go get a new technology. Let's go do, because if you've ever been in an enterprise before, the problem is you have this whole collection of old technology that have to manage licenses, ages, you know, this company got bought out by that, deprecation of blah, blah, blah. You know, life happens, especially when I'm talking, remember the three diagrams up here, the operations part down here? You know, that's where the long tail of a project typically goes. And you have to think about how can you make that part of the project as successful as the architecture and the engineering part, as well as the operations part. So thinking things long term really kind of comes into play.
Anyone else? Questions?
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
First off, thank you for the presentation. And my question is, you have a lot of experience with corporations. Do you also have experience with startups? And if so, what are 3 to 4 common problems that you ran into that you would advise from your expertise?
Okay,
So-
so let me ask you a question with your question.
Okay.
From what perspective are you coming from? Do you want to come from the startup, or do you want to come from the enterprise, or which way do you want to
From
go?
the startup perspective.
From the startup perspective, okay. And let me be transparent. I have worked as a consultant for startups, okay? And I've worked in a small company that had a startup mentality, okay? Remember I said about those personalities that are there, those positives and negatives personalities? Who you work for, who you work with can really color how successful you're going to be on that project. To be able to work together as a team is extremely important. I'll take that first part, okay? Second thing, make sure everybody understands what their role is on a project, what's going on. Third, and probably should be number one, is get very clear ideas about what it is you're trying to do. If you don't have a good solid target to shoot after and things that you can time box and put together correctly and everybody understands and agrees to what's going on, the rest of it's going to fall over itself, right? Time and money and resources. Again, this goes back to a project management methodology. Everybody has to be sensitive to that because on a startup, you probably only have, unless you're in a college dorm and you're kind of kicking together over a piece of beer, right? That's one perspective. But if you actually have somebody who says, okay, I got you $100,000, go make this app work, right? Let's kind of put it in the context of Flutter, right? Could you have, go make this work. You better know that whatever you're going to do is going to fit within that $100,000 box, okay? So getting alignment and agreement and, and leave room for discussions because, again, I think that, and I'll go back to the agile methodology of project delivery, and I mean this technical component, delivery of that, et cetera, is the more transparent you are about where you are in a project and how things are going, what the problems are, and let the team work through those problems, the more successful you'll be. Because there may be a situation to where you go, this is a great idea for us to implement this particular function, but I don't have the data. I don't have the systems of record necessary to make it happen. I can mock it up. But if I mock it up and let it go for a while, then, it's like the great Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain type of thing until certain things get fixed. So it's a good balance of how do you manage a team, what their project is, what their deliverable is, working together, getting clear requirements. I think those are really, the bread and butter right there.
Okay, thank you. I'm taking notes, by the way.
All right, guys. Anyone else? Anybody else?
I have one.
Sure.
So considering that you have so much experience
Mhm.
and there's always a different kind of project everywhere.
Yep.
Some of them are successful.
Yep.
How do you deal with the ones that are becoming a little bit less than successful? Let's say, how do you deal with failure on those projects too?
So this is where communications and trust come into play. Okay. I have been on several projects to where, we thought we understood what was going on. We worked diligently of how we said things were going to go. But as things started to be expected to be delivered, they weren't being delivered, at least the way the client wanted to see. Okay. We could have kind of swept everything under the carpet, go, yes, okay, no problem, we got it, we're going to happen. But obviously that was, we knew we were in a train wreck if that was going to happen. We kind of want to say, stop, let's have a hard conversation with the internal team. That means, and I'll go back to I'll go back to this slide here, right? I'll go back to the roles that are on the team. Project manager, product owner, the architect, UX, the key people who are really responsible for the technical delivery of the project, and understand, okay, how do we get well? What's the problem here? How do we fix this? So there's an internal conversation you have to have. And then you have to deal with the client, okay? So I remember very strongly several projects that I worked on to where we had some yelling matches, more like the client yelling at us more than anything else, right? And it's like, okay, look, we're human, things have gone wrong, and then there's negotiations for concessions, and when things get to lawsuit levels, like, no, not my problem. You guys handle it, right? But, there's people out there to kind of handle those type of things. Ideally, in my experience, the more transparent you are about what's going on a project, the more successful you'll be. Okay? Like, for example, at IBM, we had the PGA that we do, the Master Tournament. We couldn't change the date, right? You may define something, so let's say the Masters happens in April, right? You've got probably end of April, a little bit of May, a little bit of June to figure out, okay, what do we want to do next year? And then the date never moves. You better make sure that whatever you commit to is fulfillable in those dates, right? With vacations and sick time and everything else that comes into play. You have to have this vision of understanding how project management goes. So depending on your project and how you approach certain things may dictate how you approach things altogether, right? So, the word is, it depends, comes into play, right? But the more honest, transparent, and straightforward you are with people, especially the internal team, to make sure that are we on the same page, because we are representing the entity that's supposed to be delivering the solution. Are we doing the right thing? And sometimes it's okay to say, stop, I can't do this. Change the scope, add more people, add more time, change the dimension of the project, and you may have an ability to kind of affect how you're going to deliver that project. Certain parts of that dimensions may not be negotiable. Again, there's a deadline, there's an event that happens, and you've got to have it done within a month and a half before it goes, because you have to test it in the field to make sure things are going okay, right? So understanding very clearly what the goals are, what the parameters are, what the dependencies are, all along, and not just from a technical standpoint, from the business standpoint, will help you figure out, okay, is this doable or not? Okay.
To give us an idea on generally the success rate of these larger projects, what percentage of these larger projects go off without a hitch, hit every deadline? What percentage of them miss minorly, and which miss completely or get canceled?
I will say that very few of our projects went on as planned. Okay? So a lot of it had to be with people, and a lot of it had to be with transparency of certain things, right? A lot of it was expectations around certain, a lot of it was, personal behaviors on a project, not from necessarily us, but from the client. So if they didn't behave well, we couldn't behave well, and therefore we couldn't make things happen correctly. So, and this kind of goes back to the question that Erica asked, is how do you control the situation? And if you see things going off the rails, it's okay to say, hey, I got a problem. Now, it's one thing to be, what was that, the chicken running around, that type of thing, right? The sky's falling type of thing. It's one thing to be that way. It's another one to be very truthful and tactical about what's going on. I mean, hate to put it this way, but think of Star Trek, okay? You had the bridge, and all the bridge people worked together very closely. And when something went awry, people were talking to each other to solve the problem happen. You have to have that level of intercommunication and trust to make things happen correctly, okay? So, it's, going back to your question, Emmett, I would say that a good bit of the projects came within about 80% of completion. And what I mean by that is it was accepted the project was there as long as you finished the last 20%. Or, maybe even they realized, man, we've been off more we can chew. This is good right now. Let's keep refactoring it and deliver in chunks a bit later. Projects that have been absolute failures, there's been a couple. There's been a couple. Big ones too. Okay, so it's life. Okay, and that's part of the excitement about being an architect in this role is, sometimes you're watching a dumpster fire in action, and the best thing you do is pick up a fire extinguisher and go after it. Okay. Otherwise, sometimes things go smoothly, and it's great, and people learn and grow. Sunshine and rainbows all over the place. That happens too, right? But being able to understand a little bit of foresight to know that don't get too comfortable, right? There's this thing called the boiled frog syndrome, okay? To where it says, you take a frog and you drop him in hot water, he realizes hot water tries to get the hell out, right? If you take a frog, put him in lukewarm water and raise the temperature of the water over a while, frog doesn't care, he'll boil to death. There's been several projects where we've been boiled frogs. Don't be a boiled frog. Speak up. I guess is the best way to say it.
The architectural documents, what's the threshold for when you need one? I feel like that can get out of hand with like change orders of like, oh, this one, hold on, we need to make a document.
Okay.
How do you cut down?
Sure. Well, it's one of those things to where so there's a couple different angles to your answer, right? One is, how does the condition affect the health and structure of the project? Okay, so for example, if doing something requires extra resources, time, money, people, what have you, or reduction because of other conditions, obviously that's more of a financial contractual obligation, and you better document that, okay, because that can lead you to legal situations. If it's a functional change, like, again, if you're in that defined design cycle of a project, and you come up and say, look, I can go down 3 or 4 paths here, and I can see clarity on each one of these and reasons why you would want to do one path over another, that's the kind of time in which you do this. If you ever come to a point to where in a project to where things break, like, we're using a MySQL database over here, and we really need to scale it up into something that's a sharded database and blah, blah, blah. Again, because of impacts from a technical scope or project management scope, I would document those. But the little kind of picky uni type things, until they start affecting the project, I'd say, let it roll. It's part of the normal processes, right? That's part of the friction of the project.
Any more questions? Great. Well, thanks so much, Mike.
You bet.
Everyone online will be back here next month. Yeah,
For test-driven development.
for
Part
test-driven
two.
development part 2.
Okay, thanks, guys.